Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to see all of you here today, although I realize that there's nothing else going on that might distract you. I'm Deborah Leff. I'm director of the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum, and on behalf of the library and the Kennedy Library Foundation, I welcome you to the first in our 2003 Forum series. I'd like to thank our newest sponsor who's with us, Fleet Boston Financial, and also our other sponsors, WBUR, who's here today, the Lowell Institute, Boston Capital, the Boston Globe, and Boston.com. As you all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'll be brief. We picture presidents the way we do in large part because of the remarkable work of our panelists today. Cecil Stoughton began his career as a photographer in 1940 when he joined the Army Air Corps. In 1961, his skill as a photographer won him the White House assignment of keeping a photographic record of President John F. Kennedy's days in office, whether here or abroad. His marvelous images of President and Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline, and John make him a treasure at this library. After President Kennedy's death, Mr. Stoughton remained at the White House with President Johnson. David Hume Kennerly began his career at age 15 by publishing a photograph in his high school paper. In his early 20s, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his extraordinary photographs of Vietnam. You probably know him from that memorable photograph of President Nixon waving goodbye on the White House lawn just before he left office. You also know him from the years when he was only in his 20s as White House photographer to President Gerald Ford. He has photographed more than 35 covers for Time and Newsweek, and he has agreed to sign his new book, Photo du Jour, after this forum. All photographers will have books that they're willing to sign after this forum. Diana Walker has spent more than 2 decades as contract photographer for Time magazine, and she covered the White House beat when President Reagan and the first President George Bush were in office. She's won awards from the World Press, the White House News Photographers Association, and the National Photographers Association. Many of her captivating photographs appear in her marvelous new book, Public and Private, 20 Years Photographing the Presidency. And on Super Bowl Sunday, we are pleased to have with us non-commercial National Public Radio's Susan Stamberg here to moderate this conversation. Ms. Stamberg has won every major award in broadcasting. She is the guest host of NPR Morning Edition and Weekend Edition Saturday. She also simply does the best reporting that exists on cultural issues, and it's a delight to have her here. Susan.
Thank you. Deborah, I thought you were going to talk about my wonderful sports prowess. That's what I thought we were leading up to here. Hi, everybody, fellow ping pong fans. You know, Dan Shore at National Public Radio, always on the Saturday morning, Weekend Edition, before Super Bowl Sunday, is asked by Scott Simon, "So, Dan, who are you for in the Super Bowl?" To which Dan replies, "Who's playing?" But he got that funny line from me because I don't know either. Anyway, it's wonderful to see you all here, and I can't wait to hear and see the work of these 3 amazing photographers. Every journalist, you know, dreams of being a fly on the wall. And what wall would we rather sit on and buzz about than the walls that belong to the White House? As a radio broadcaster, I have to tell you that that is an impossible dream. In the first place, I do not believe in using hidden microphones, and it's a policy at National Public Radio that you don't do that. And the microphones and the tape recorders that we use are extremely visible, but at least we carry around nothing with us that is as obvious and as clunky as a camera. So can you imagine hauling all that photography equipment around and trying to simply disappear, which has been part of these people's job descriptions for these many decades. But miraculously, these men and women have achieved what sounds to me to be an impossible goal. And more than that, some of them have even been able to do it by invitation as the official presidential photographer and come away with enormous insights, I think, as you will see, about the nature of the presidency and also the nature of the particular presidents they covered. In this age of microphones, and even worse than that, television cameras, these still photographers have spent their careers hunting down what Henri Cartier-Bresson called the decisive moment from men, alas, mostly from men, who spent their careers, and this is the part that intrigues me the most, shaping their images, covering, masking, coating their images for public consumption. So I like that dynamic very much, and I want to hear more about it, how you get to the real person behind the public person. That's been their work as well. You know that there are cultures, it's really a cliche to talk about it, in which people believe that photographs steal one's soul. Ours is not such a culture, as you know too well. But the work of these photographers, when it's very good, and it usually is, serves to present the souls of the people whom they are photographing in a new and a different light. And sometimes when they are successful, the images can touch our souls and give us a much deeper understanding, a deeper sense of the human face of power and the toll that power very often takes on those who wield it. I'm very pleased to be in their company. I'm eager to see and hear about their work. We begin with Cecil Stoughton, who was the official photographer for President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Mr. Stoughton.
Thank you all. I appreciate the reference to the back-breaking camera equipment that I carried. You probably noticed I'm walking a little gingerly. It grows on you. Anyhow, I've never addressed such a huge assembly in my career. I'm honored that you showed up on Super Bowl Sunday. Imagine that. Well, we're going to get right to the pictures. I wasn't sure that the introduction were going to include any of the chronology of the how I got there and how do you get a job like that type of question, but I suppose it would be in order to tell you that my assignment was strictly a military assignment. I was in the Army at the time. I had spent a number of years in the Air Force and commissioned in the Army as a photographer or a photo officer, but officers don't do anything. They delegate. So I didn't think I was going to have a chance of continuing my career as a photographer, but fortunately for me, I did. And it worked well because the general that I was working for in the Pentagon was the chief information officer and was responsible for publicizing everything that the Army did. And I was working directly for him on the special assignments. And when he was selected to be the military aide to the president in early January, my future was cast for me, and I didn't realize it at the time. But I went across the river on his coattails and managed to make a job for myself. And as it happened, it turned out to be the legacy that I left my family for. The golden years that I spent at the White House will not be transcended by any other job, I'm sure. And the people that followed me, to include David and Diana to a degree, have my footsteps to follow as far as being the in-house photographer, and I'd like to say as compared to an outhouse photographer. It always gets a laugh. But let me just stop there and spend my time. We're limited in time, I understand, and I want to give as much to you as I can on these captions of these pictures. So without further ado, we'll go to the pictures, please. Well, okay, I'm surprised. This was the end of the carousel. It should have been the last picture instead of the first, but wiser heads than mine prevail. That's close. We were going to discuss some of these to a little degree, so you'll have an indication of how the pictures came about. But I think going through them quickly like this, you'll get an idea you'll get an idea that I was there and that you've seen these pictures before. Now, that's picture number one. And that would be former President Harry Truman entertaining the East Room crowd of a dignitary back in 1961. And the young man standing behind him, as I recall, was a Army sergeant in Poland when Potsdam, when they signed the agreements back in the close of the war in 45. So the president was a guest, and someone prevailed on him to play his favorite song, the Missouri Waltz, which he did, and captured a nice night at the White House. Now we can go on to the next slide and see what happens. Okay, this is another eventful night. Pablo Casal's coming out of retirement at Jackie's request. I'll use the literal Jackie as compared to Mrs. Kennedy. But she wanted to have nothing but the best for her guests, the president and wife of the Puerto Rican country. So Pablo put on his performance. Now, Mark Shaw and I stood shoulder to shoulder for this picture. And I think if we check the hand clapping and the facial expressions, it's going to be very difficult to tell them apart. And I understand on one occasion, Mrs. Shaw saw this picture downstairs and said, how come Mark didn't get credit for it? And someone in the library told her that because he didn't take that one, because they were identical. But anyhow, that's Pablo Casals. Next slide, please. What's next? There we go. You've seen this before. This is a special request from Mrs. Kennedy to leave a gift for the donor of the house that they were spending the summer in 1962, Morton Downey, the famous Irish tenor. And she asked me to take the picture on Saturday and deliver it to her on Sunday so that she could leave it Monday morning when they left the house. So I had to take the picture, fly to Washington, have it processed, have it printed, go to Tiffany's, get a silver frame, put it in the frame, fly it back, and give it to her, and she left it on the grand piano in the living room of the house before she left. It's received quite a bit of publicity over the past few years, covers of magazines and stuff like that. But it's a warm family kind of picture, which is what they were when I was privileged to be with them. We'll go to the next slide, please. The famous dancing picture. One day sitting outside of Evelyn Lincoln's office, which was my post when there were off-the-record visitors due to come into the president's office, I'd never know until he entertained them whether or not he wanted a photograph made, so I had to be close at hand. And I heard this god-awful noise coming out of the White House, out of the Oval Office. And I asked Evelyn, I said, what's that? She said, well, that's the president. Go on in and take some pictures. So I went in with my super wide Hasselblad and a 12 exposure roll of black and white film and made 12 pictures of the children dancing and cavorting like this. Later on in the afternoon, I brought a set of 12 8x10 prints and was showing them to Evelyn out at her desk. The president looked out through the open door and saw her and said, what do you got, Captain? And I said, I got the pictures I took this morning. He said, come in, let me see them. So I went in and stood behind him at his desk while they riffled through these pictures. He picked this one out of the 12, called Pierre Salinger and said, Pierre, let's give this to the press. He said, they're always after us for pictures of the children. Let them use this for their birthday because their birthdays are both in November. Well, it was used the next day, 5 and 6 columns wide in every metropolitan daily just about in the country and eventually around the world. And it's been being seen every time somebody wants to talk about the Kennedys, this picture comes up. But it's, again, a happy time. I had the president autograph a copy for me, and he said, for Captain Stoughton, who captured beautifully a happy moment at the White House. And I thought that was sufficient unto the day. Next slide, please. Sotheby's made this big during the big auction a few years ago, but this was a night that Mrs. Kennedy asked me to come up and make a series of pictures of her putting the children to bed, so to speak, putting them in their little jammies and playing with them. And I have a real soft spot in my heart for little John being such a ham and doing such good things that make good pictures. Next slide, please. Now we're into the famous Cuban Missile Crisis, of which there were little or no pictures made. It's just these people sitting around a cabinet room table deciding the fate of the world. Nothing important, you understand. But I sat outside this cabinet room for 8 or 9 days after we came back from Chicago. There was a 13-day lapse there for the crisis. I waited until the last day for someone to tell me that I could go in and make some pictures. And when I went in, I made a series of 8 or 9 pictures. The president got a phone call, had to leave the room, so it was like the air going out of the balloon. But I managed to make a couple of round table pictures with everybody at them. I think the next slide will show more of the people. So we'll have the next slide, please. Yeah, this is the whole room. All of the people are members of the ex-com, and they were discussing the press release that the president was going to make, telling the world that we were not going to go to war that day. We weren't going to be blown off the face of the earth. Saturday, on the other hand, the day before, was a pretty black day. We called it Black Saturday, and I call this Happy Sunday, because I was able to record these pictures for the crisis, and they will forever be indicative of what went on that day. Next slide, please. The 3 brothers. Well, one day I was again at my post outside of Evelyn's office, and Robert and Edward were in there with their brother. And when the little meeting broke up, the president came out into Evelyn's office with Edward, Teddy, and I said, I don't have a picture of the 3 of you brothers together. Meanwhile, Bobby had gone down the walkway down to his limousine in the inner circle of the White House, and he went to the door and hollered, "Hey, Bobby, come on back. Captain wants to take a picture." So Bobby came running back up the walkway, and they posed for me, standing side by side. Bobby decided he was the shortest one of the bunch, so he'd accentuate that and do this little kneeling thing. But 3 happy brothers, family picture that I admire. Next slide, please. Easter Sunday, 1963. This was a famous day for me because the day before, Saturday, I'd been to the house. Mrs. Kennedy wanted to talk to me about some pictures about tomorrow, which was Easter Sunday, to tell me to be sure and get a good picture of the 4 of them together, as compared to last year, which when they came out of this same doorway, which is a door into the chapel area of the president's father's, Ambassador Kennedy's Palm Beach home, she said, "You didn't get a good one last year." Well, I said, "You guys didn't stop. You just kept walking." He was leading Caroline, and she was carrying John, and they just walked out like a file of Indians, so they didn't stop. And I said, "You're going to have to stop and look at the camera, at least stop for a minute or two." So that was what she was talking to me about. Meanwhile, she's in a bathing suit, and it looked like she'd swallowed a pumpkin. And I hadn't seen that before. Nobody else had, and they hadn't announced her pregnancy. But fortunately for me, they did it the next day, and I didn't have to carry that secret around for a few more days. But at that time, I think I was one of the few people that was aware of the event to forthcome. Okay, next slide, please. I use this a lot because the cigar he's smoking is a Upman from Cuba, and his mess steward and I had an understanding. I would trade him photographs of him giving cigars to the president, and he would give me cigars that belonged to the president. So I was able to snitch a couple of his Cubans periodically. This has been used a number of times, but the glasses on his head is an example of vanity. Thy name is glasses on my head. And Didn't like pictures with glasses, and there's another story that I won't bother to tell about another person. But let's go to the next slide. The summer of '63 was a beautiful summer picture-wise. I had occasion to go with them to Hyannis on each weekend, leaving Friday night and flying to Hyannis, spending Saturday and Sunday doing whatever the children and the family were doing in the way of entertainment or sports or gatherings, parties, whatever. And we always rode on the Honeyfits every day, Saturday and Sunday. And I had a motion picture camera, and I was making footage of the same thing. But I thought this was a striking example of a beautiful, loving father and daughter. Next slide, please. This could be, and probably is, the last picture I made of the president. He's at the fence at Love Field in Dallas, and down in the foreground, I'm standing on a little streetlight balustrade that's up about 18 inches off the ground. I'm hanging on with one hand and shooting with one hand. And as he walked by, this was the last picture I made. He went from there to get in the car, and the car, of course, went down the street. And we all know what happened down around the corner. Next slide, please. This is what I did when they asked me, where were you during the assassination? This was what I did. I was sitting in the car, open convertible, with my colleagues, the Associated Press and United Press and Life magazine photographer. And I switched a normal lens to a telephoto lens on a Hasselblad that I was using. Made this one frame, but it's kind of indicative of the event. That's a grassy knoll behind them. I didn't know what it was at the time, but that's what they call the grassy knoll. The family is the Newman family, I found out later. And the two photographers jumped out of their car, which was in front of us. One of them is a Navy photographer, and the other one is NBC photographer. They jumped back in their cars eventually, but meanwhile, we sped away and followed the cars to the Parkland Hospital, which could be the next slide, I'm not sure. Yeah, well, within a few minutes, having gone out there rather quickly, when I realized that President Johnson had become president during the time at the hospital, President Kennedy expired while I was standing outside the operating room door, and one of my colleagues was the signal communicator, and he was holding an open line to the switchboard in Washington, and he had to go and establish another room upstairs. He asked me to hold this open line, talk to it, keep it alive, and just at that moment, I saw the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson going out the exit rather hurriedly. And I said, "Where's he going?" And I nodded my head like that. And he said, "The President's going to Washington." So I knew then that Kennedy had expired and that it behooved me to be with the President of the United States. And I knew that Johnson wouldn't go very far without having a picture made of the swearing in, so it behooved me to be with him. So I immediately handed him back his receiver and said, "So am I," and picked up my camera bag and got a hitched a ride to the airport with a couple of other Johnson aides, Valenti for one. And we went out to Air Force One. I dashed up the steps to ensure a ride on the Air Force One because I knew that there was going to be a ceremony someplace. And then I found out they were going to do it on the plane. So in the meantime, the casket is coming in, and these are the only pictures made of it being loaded aboard the plane. Let's see what the next one says. Well, that says it all. This was the swearing-in picture that you see every November, and in history books, my colleagues will agree that an exclusive, a one-of-a-kind picture is rare these days. There's always somebody lurking in the bushes, but this was the only picture that was ever made of that event, and it will hopefully go down in history as such. I think that's the end of the stills. So we got a little movie clip that's ready to roll. And how's my time doing, Tom? We'll have some questions and stuff a little later on if anybody has any, so that we don't waste the time. Whenever you're ready. This is where little John is learning to salute. Little did I know at the time that he was going to be doing that within a couple of weeks. This was the 13th of November in '63. We're out at the Atoka farm in Virginia. Jackie's leading a leprechaun, the pony, up to the president, who's feeding him sugar cubes. And as you will see, the pony becomes very hungry, avid, greedy, pushy. Can't you just see Calvin Coolidge doing that? The captain called down, or the president called down to me. He said, "Keep shooting, Captain. You're about to see a president being eaten by a horse." And he's showing the pony that he doesn't have any more sugar cubes, but as it turned out, one of my colleagues here in the building tells me that when Mrs. Kennedy presented the clothing to be stored for posterity, they found a sugar cube in one of his pockets. So that's one that the pony didn't get. I think I've used my time and done just about everything I can do for you. We'll talk questions and answers. Oh, we're still eating sugar. Okay.
Come on over here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you some questions now. Mr. Stoughton, what were the rules? I mean, you didn't have, it sounds from what you said as if you were invited to come in and take pictures, but you couldn't be that fly on the wall that I was talking about. You couldn't hang around all the time.
No, with President Kennedy, it was a little different than with President Johnson, for one thing. Like night and day, the difference. But I attended all of the official functions, all of the press photo ops. We didn't call them, it hadn't become a photo op yet,
right.
But when the photographers were invited in, I was part of that package also. And rarely was I in there prior to the press being invited for Kennedy, because it wasn't necessary for him. I'd be lucky to get 2 frames out of a posed picture. I'd take one and he'd start to go away, and I'd say, could I have another? And I'd take 2, but that would max it out for him, because he just wasn't interested in standing around wasting time taking pictures. He'd rather be talking and doing what he did.
So he didn't have that sense that this is a moment in history for which we must have a document. It sounds as if she did, in a way. If she wanted you to take those Easter pictures and that she was making a document. But it sounds as if he didn't have the time for it.
That's about the way I describe it. He just would prefer to be doing his thing rather than me doing mine.
Yeah.
Pictures were not important to him.
Yeah. Fairly recently, medical records of his were released, and we learned the extent to which he was under medication, in great pain, and out of commission. And it's so amazing to me that in all the photographs we see of him, and just about at every public event, he had all of that vigor, how would he say it? Vigor. And tremendous energy, it seemed. Were you, was your access at all related to that, do you think, that you were called upon and permitted in when he was looking good and feeling good?
No, I wasn't prevented from doing anything as far as the health aspect goes.
Right.
We didn't see a clip, but I've got pictures of him swimming in the Cape Cod, outside of his home there in the August and September, when the water is still a little chilly, but he and Caroline and their guests jump off with the honey fits into the water, and he was very active doing that as far as showing the girdle that he was wearing for his back, mustard plaster, whatever that thing was. But it's visible, and he had no objection to that. As for the daily activity, I could tell that when he walked like me, if you probably notice I'm walking gingerly, I know how he feels now, and I know what he was going through in the way of aching bones. But mine are a little older than his were.
Yeah.
We were only 3 years apart, so we were close. So I know what his pain. I can feel his pain.
Yeah, yeah. You have some lovely pictures of the family, and one of them on the yacht, the picture of Carolyn and the president. You took another in which, it interested me, you didn't choose to show that one, in which that father is looking at his daughter like this. She's telling him something.
Right.
I bet every one of us has one of the photographs taken by these people just engraved in our minds, and this is certainly mine. Of yours, Mr. Stoughton, and the full attention, the nature of the attention that he is paying to her.
Yeah,
but you took it with a long lens, and I wanted to ask you the ground rules on that.
Well, like I say, on the Honeyfits, it's a 35, 40-foot, maybe 50-foot, 80-foot boat. And
It's bigger over time.
It just keeps growing. I guess it's around 80. Anyhow, there's nobody on board except the crew, a 5 or 6 man crew, and the president, his lady, and children, and their guests. And many times there were 3 or 4 people. So we're talking maybe 8 or 10 people, but they're always on the fantail where the seats are, and they serve lunch and libations and like that. And I'm up 25, 30 feet away with a long lens, just capturing little vignettes of all these things happening. I didn't go down with the wide angle and get in their faces. They knew I was there. They didn't do anything that they wouldn't have done ordinarily. If they forgot I was there, well,
So much the better.
So much the better.
Yeah.
I did have a picture once of Jackie with a cigarette in her hand, and that was, nobody ever said don't do it. I just knew enough not to do it. I go back to a time in my, I don't want to take somebody else's time.
That's okay, we're good.
I
30 more
learned,
seconds.
I learned a lesson back in 1945 when President Truman was president, and his daughter, Margaret, was in a sorority group at one of the hotels in Washington. And I was the photographer for a studio that had an office in this hotel. And my job was to take pictures of gatherings, functions. And I went into this sorority meeting and made a picture. And then I came outside of the room, and I'm sitting like I'm talking to you, and I'm talking to this young man. And I was telling him about the picture I just made of Margaret and her girlfriends, and they were handing her a tray of drinks, and she started to reach for a drink, but she didn't. And I think it's at that time that I took this picture. He said, "Oh." He said, "Where's the film?" I said, "Well, it's shooting speed graphics now. We're talking this slide holder with 2 pieces of film." And I had since put it in my camera bag. And he said, "Let's go to your lab." He was a Secret Service guy. I didn't know that.
Wow.
He went to the dark room with me, stayed in the dark room with me while I processed the film. When I got it out of the hypo and held it up and looked at it, and he looked at it, and he just immediately ripped it up right in front of me.
Wow.
So I learned a lesson real quick. You don't mess around with those guys.
Yeah. Good. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Mr. Kennerly.
Okay, we're going to see if we can overcome technology here. Yeah, that might work. We had I was pointing out to everybody here that I've yet to have a PowerPoint presentation go without grave difficulty. And today was no example. For those of you who came in early, we went right down to the wire, but we made it work. And I'm really happy to be here, and Cecil and I are old friends. In fact, we have a nice shot of us together with President Bush the former, and with Mike Evans, who was a White House photographer during Reagan, and I think Dave Valdez, who was Bush's photographer. But I started out in this business a little after Cecil did, but I've been doing it now since... I have a little cold, you'll have to excuse me. Since probably 64. I graduated from high school in 65. And one of the first political assignments that I had, actually the first major political figure that I covered was Robert Kennedy in Portland, Oregon. I'm a native Oregonian, and I was working for the Oregon Journal. And that was a great moment for me. He was an exciting person to photograph. I was, I think, a sophomore in high school when he was shot. And let's just go ahead, Ira, and Ira Wyman's helping me out today because, thank you, fellow photog. This is a picture I took of, any way to lower these lights a little bit? We have to, thank you. This was in 1968. Robert Kennedy became my assignment as a young UPI photographer in Los Angeles. And I photographed him briefly one day up in Portland, but I was actually assigned the last few days of his campaign through the West in Arizona, New Mexico, and next in the night at the Ambassador Hotel. And this is a picture I took. I was mentioning to somebody earlier that years later I saw this film, and when he gave this V sign, he did it so fast. I had no idea. And so there aren't a lot of these pictures around. There were other people got it, but one of my colleagues was actually up on the podium with him and went back into the kitchen, so I wasn't back there when he got shot. But I think this was one of the worst days of my life to date because he had been so kind to me, and there were several photographers following him around. Bill Epridge, who was back there when he was shot, and some others. And the Kennedys really had a sense of the camera, and I think it worked very well both ways, where those of us taking pictures obviously were getting great shots, and he was getting great coverage, and his image was certainly not hurt by any of these photographs. And then later, I'm going to fast forward here because I became President Gerald Ford's official White House photographer. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Cecil, that Okamoto was the first official civilian to do it with that title of White House photographer. Ollie Atkins with Nixon was the second one. I was the third one. And Oki had a relationship with Johnson that was very interesting. Okamoto and I became very good friends, and he told me about how Johnson was really very aware of the pictures. He didn't like being taken from a certain angle. Cecil would know better than I never covered him. But this photograph ran in Time magazine right at the height of Watergate. It showed a man who was being affected physically in a way. And in fact, after it ran in Time, I was criticized by the White House for shooting a picture out of context and all of that. And actually, after Nixon resigned, one of the key White House people said that picture was very difficult for them over there because it really did show a man who was under tremendous strain. Next shot. Well, culminating, of course, in him resigning. This was August 9th, 1974, and I have a whole series of pictures. I just, for some reason, I shot it. I had a motor drive on my camera, and there were about 25 frames in a sequence showing him looking back, ironically, really toward the White House, and then this moment, and then everybody was applauding, and he gave the old Nixon double V sign and got on the chopper, and that was it. And that night, then President Ford, who was sworn in at noon, I went into the East Room for that, asked me to come over to his house in Alexandria, and it was the night where we talked about me being the White House photographer, and he said, what would it take, what would you like to do if you're doing this? I said, well, I would just like total access and the use of Air Force One on the weekends. He said, well, Dave, I think the access is no problem, but I don't know about the Air Force One. Go ahead. But he really was kind of living in a upper middle class neighborhood over in Alexandria, and this is right after he became president. It was commuting back and forth to the White House until all the Nixon things were out of there and they had moved their stuff over. Go ahead. And the picture shows the empty shelves in the background, and all the stuff was gone of Nixon's. None of the Ford stuff had been put in. Another thing about this moment is it really kind of showed the difference in style of the new man who was taking over the White House. And in fact, I understand you're doing, the library's doing something on tapes of different, what sounds like a great program from FDR. People who tape conversations, that's something, well, I'd never do. But right underneath his foot there is this dictaphone, which is sort of the Smithsonian edition of a tape recorder. And he pulled that out, and it was a little red kind of reel. He says, I held it up, and he said, I wonder if this is one of the tapes. Go ahead, Ira. Yeah, that's me. This is my Abbey Road picture with President Ford. But I was 27 years old when I took over this job. Thanks. I'd just come back from Vietnam. I'd been in Vietnam for 2.5 years. I was, as somebody wrote a story saying that the only beards before I got into the White House were on the portraits of long dead presidents. And, but I had tremendous access. He really let me do everything all the time. Cecil was saying he had to wait outside. I mean, I never, just part of my deal with him was to be able to cover the White House, not only the day-to-day stuff in the office and out, but Mrs. Ford welcomed me to the second floor of the White House, and so I really had the run of the place. It was the most amazing time that you could imagine, and I knew it would be over with at some point, so I worked like 12, 16 hours a day, and I got very sick one time, and I got a call. I was climbing out of bed, like I just felt so bad. It was about 6 a.m., 5:30, 6 a.m. The phone rang, and it was the president, and he ordered me to stay home. The White House doctor said, look, Kennerly's about ready to die here, so he said, you got to tell him to stay home or he won't do it. I didn't want to miss anything. Go ahead. And this is the kind of thing I didn't want to miss. This was the day that Ford pardoned Nixon. It was right after, it was Sunday morning, and he signed the pardon just a few minutes before this and came into Bill Timmons' office, who was the congressional liaison man. And there's the picture of Nixon still up on the wall, and it was just a barrage of criticism, probably more. His popularity went lower than Truman's did after he fired MacArthur, I think. The hatred for Nixon, I think nobody realized the depths of it, and what was interesting to me was a lot of people calling up or privately telling him that he'd done the right thing, but that they were criticizing him in public. And a couple of weeks later, and he was we're in an elevator, and I said, do you think by pardoning Nixon on a Sunday morning that nobody was going to notice? But fortunately, he had a good sense of humor, despite what a lot of people think. Go ahead. This is actually, I think, one of my most important pictures in a way. And again, I could be English for my sense of irony. I think these men of the Security Council are all sitting under a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt. Nobody's saying anything, and it was in this meeting that the president pulled the plug on the American involvement in Vietnam, the final American evacuation. And it was William Colby, Kissinger's Deputy Secretary of State, whom no one can remember, including me at this moment, Secretary Schlesinger of Defense and his deputy and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Rockefeller. But these were the main guys. Go ahead. And then there were other people that showed up at the White House. George Harrison, Jack Ford, one of the president's son, and the one who probably had the most time, probably the best time out of the whole time. Somebody saw this picture one time, and George was sitting in the president's chair, and he says, "My God, we lost." Go ahead. This is why President Ford didn't win the GQ Best Dressed Award. And on the right is Don Rumsfeld, who was he brought in as his Chief of Staff, Rumsfeld brought Dick Cheney along with him, obviously grooming him for the vice presidency. But this was an example of I think President Ford was probably the least vain person I've ever worked with. I released this photo at one point, and it was really a pleasure to work around somebody who really, truly didn't notice that you were around. And actually, the first 2 or 3 days that Ford became president, he's such a polite guy that I would be in the Oval Office, and every time somebody would walk in, he'd introduce me to him, and so I couldn't get pictures. So finally, I had to say, well, I really appreciate, the gesture, but could you please just, forget that I'm here? And that all worked out. Go ahead. This was in Akasaka Palace in Tokyo, and there was a big story about President Ford's white tie affair. This is just for the greeting with the emperor, that his pants were too short. And that's what people wrote about it, as opposed to the first president after World War II to visit Japan. But I asked him about it later. He said, well, it wasn't so much that my pants were too short, it's that they would have fallen off if I didn't have the short suspenders on, and I couldn't get longer suspenders. Anyway, go ahead. This is this is the Japanese version of our game where you pass the apple underneath. And it was this geisha girl. Believe it or not, this is a state dinner in Kyoto. It's the kind of state dinner President Clinton would have killed for, I'm sure. But so the idea was to take the straw, and the next slide was Don Rumsfeld, who had his own spin on it. But the guy I really admired more than anybody is the next person, Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger, to his credit, I mean, these pictures actually appeared in Life magazine later, but I didn't have to, but I showed him the pictures and said, would you mind if I did this? And they're public domain pictures, but he said, oh, no, that's a funny picture. But you never see him without his glasses, which makes it even more kind of startling to see this. Go ahead. And this is Leonid Brezhnev, for anybody here under like 30, 40, who was the head of the Soviet Union. One of the great advantages, as Cecil knows, of working in the White House is that you got close to people that normally you would just never get this close to, and this was in Helsinki in 1976. And actually, this 5 prints of this picture went back with one of Kissinger's guys later when he went over to have another summit, and he gave him to Brezhnev to sign, one for the president, Kissinger, and Brezhnev looked at him and picked him up and walked out of the room, and he came back with one of these like 1945 pictures of himself with a big medal. He signed it. He said, I think you'll like this one better. So had I been the Soviet chief photographer, I would be pushing up daisies somewhere. This is in Vladivostok in 1974. President Ford has referred to this as one of the shortest staff meetings he ever had. It was in minus 30 degree weather because all the rooms were bugged. This is the first summit with Brezhnev. Fascinating time, and we were in there, but they were huddled outside. Go ahead. And on the left is what I would see, because this was after Ford had just beaten Reagan out for the nomination in Kansas City in 1976. And Ford was never real happy about the fact that Reagan ran against him, the incumbent president. And on the right they were on their way to this press conference. This is what the public saw, a real nice, chummy little... And actually, the two of them didn't see that much of each other after that. Reagan didn't do a lot of campaigning for him, and there was always a little resentment about that. Go ahead. And Mrs. Ford loves this picture. I took it. She didn't know that I was in the room, but she was looking out toward the Oval Office, is directly down below. And this is on the second floor of the White House, which is the family quarters. And she felt that this kind of captured, in a way, the being in a fishbowl, yet it's kind of lonely. And Mrs. Ford and I were actually, I just saw her in Palm Springs. Had 5 first ladies out there last week celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Betty Ford Center. The day before Ford left office, which is January 19th of 77, Mrs. Ford and I were walking around in the West Wing, and she's poking her head in and saying goodbye to people and all that. And we walked by the cabinet room, and she said, you know, I've always wanted to dance on the cabinet room table. So let's see that. I don't think you're going to see Laura Bush doing this. But Mrs. Ford was a Martha Graham dancer, and here she is in the middle of this male domain. You know, wars are won and lost in the room, and she took her shoes off and hopped up there, and she jumped off, and she kind of wiped her head like this, and she said, well, I think that'll about do it for me here. And years later, I did a book called Photo Op, which was like 30 years of my pictures, and this picture had never been published. It was actually restricted in the Ford archive, but I really wanted this in my book, but I didn't want to just show it to her and say, could I use this picture? And I don't think she'd even seen it. And so I put it in all the layouts, and all the layouts were done. It was in context with how I wanted to run it. And so I first saw President Ford, and I showed him the layouts. He goes through it. He finds this one shot of him campaigning and he's surrounded by 25 Kilgore Rangerettes. And he said, oh, I remember that was a great day of campaigning. And then I flipped it over, and the next page, there's this picture of Mrs. Ford. And he says, oh, Betty's not going to like this. And I go, oh, man, I really want this picture in my book, because this is really her personality. She is so incredible. And so later, she came in and looked through it. She came to this page, and she just started laughing and said, that's great. I said, well, you don't mind if I use it? She said, no, of course not. It's fine. And the president said, well, Betty, you never told me you did that. And she said, well, Jerry, there are a lot of things I haven't told you. Now, I just threw this in because this is George W. Bush's dad, younger than George W. Bush is now, sitting in the Oval Office. This is one of the first meetings that President Ford had when he became president. But I'll tell you, and Cecil could tell you, Diana could certainly tell you that what happens in this room, this Oval Office, is phenomenal. And the history of the place, who walks through there. We've seen, you know, John F. Kennedy playing with his kids in there, and God knows, I mean, there have just been so many fascinating events, some of which we can't go into. But the next picture, though, is one that I really like, and that's in the same little different angle, but here's young son George Bush with Clinton. In the background is Helen Thomas. This is the first time that Bush had been in the Oval Office since being elected president. And Helen Thomas is in the background, who's covered every president since John Adams, I think. She is Helen and I worked together at UPI, and she is one of the most incredible people on the face of the earth, and a great writer. 6 first ladies at the Bush Library event, and Hillary was, Mrs. Clinton was the first lady then. She actually showed up for the event in Palm Springs. And the next one, which I will end with, this was the first time that 5 presidents were ever together, standing in one place at the Reagan Library opening in 1991. Now, I've actually been to all 3 times where they've been together, Nixon's funeral, and then the memorial service at the National Cathedral was the last time. But this was the best picture, probably, the sort of Mount Rushmore kind of feeling. The great thing about it is a lot of people buy this picture, both Republicans and Democrats. Thank God for Jimmy Carter. That's all I can say. The lone Democrat in this shot. And but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that okay on the call? Dying up here. It's too much, huh?
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Tell us what it was like now to go from that sort of inner sanctum, working as the personal photographer, to being back with the pack. What that transition was like once you left the Ford White House.
I had a lot less dates after that. That was the worst part. No, I felt the day that, and of course, once President Ford lost the election, I mean, I knew, the clock was ticking. It was going to be over with, and But I don't think anything really prepares you for this. I mean, believe it or not, the first time I really had sort of an emotional crisis that was something that was just bigger than anything I've ever dealt with was right after I won the Pulitzer Prize. I was 25 years old. I didn't know I'd even been nominated for it. So it came as a shock, and I just kept wondering what it was I was going to do. I mean, what did this mean?
Excuse me, let me interrupt you. You won it for your coverage of the Vietnam War.
And actually Vietnam, Cambodia, and India, but that's, who cares, right?
Wow.
But it was such a profound moment. But after, in a different way then, after the day after President Ford left office, he flew out to California. I went with him for a few days. But when I got back to Washington, I had this phone in my house. It was a direct line to the signal operators, the military operators. And just for the hell of it, I picked it up, and I was really hoping to say, "Yes, Mr. Kennerly." And it was dead. And I thought, so am I. I'm dead, too. And I mean, the motorcade had sped off, and I was standing by the side of the road, and I had my little suitcase, and it was pretty tough because having been inside for so long and really just going from total access to no access. Yeah. I mean, there was an alien life form in the White House at that point, that had beaten the guy I worked for. And although he's gone on to win a Nobel Prize, and he's a wonderful man, but that was tough for me.
Mm-hmm. I wonder what, and you're not the one to ask about it. Well, you may be in part, what it's like when you have to be covering a president whom you detest. I remember interviewing Oki. What was his full name? Yoichi Okamoto, who was Lyndon Johnson's. You said he was the first official White House photographer.
First civilian. Yeah.
Civilian. And he told all the stories about being so upset that Johnson lifted up, that famous picture, lifted up his shirt to show the scar from his surgery and all of that. And he said, "I told the old guy not to do that. I told him not to. I knew there'd be a picture taken of that and it would get out all over." And it was at a point at which Johnson was not particularly popular in the public ear. And I said to him, "You really cared about him, didn't you?" And he said, "I love that SOB." But I wonder what it's like when you don't.
Well, I think photographers tend to have the non-judgmental gene, and it makes our life easier. And although I will say, quite frankly, I mean, there was no president that I detested, and I mean, everybody has their own interesting persona. I mean, Nixon was an incredibly interesting guy to cover. I did, he being the first president, incumbent president that I was photographing, but everything he did, the fact that he was kind of secretive, and there was this Shakespearean shroud around him, and it just made it terrific. And in fact, the photographers and the cartoonists, held a private funeral after he had to resign
because he made their life so
oh my gosh,
good.
What are you going to do with, Richard Nixon, this dark, brooding character, to Gerald Ford, the guy from Michigan who used to play football. I mean, it was different.
Yeah,
so,
but it's something I wonder about all of you. Do you consider yourself journalists, or once you're inside that bubble, whether you're the personal photographer or not, you're near the plane, you're on the plane, you're traveling with that group, and it really is a little hard to maintain a distance, I would think.
Well, just in my own case, quite frankly, President Ford, I said, I can't do this job if people are going to tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. And I reported directly to him. I didn't report to Rumsfeld. I didn't report to anybody else. It was a direct line of communication with him, which made a lot of people angry. I mean, they couldn't, trying to control me was trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. I mean, it was an impossible task. And but he let me do, and it was very important to him that I had my own space, I guess how you'd put it. That he believed in my journalistic integrity and had nothing to hide. And so it was like, for me, I walked out of there really feeling that I'd done a journalistic job.
Well, what did he mean by believing in your journalistic integrity? In that context, what did that mean? What did that mean to you?
Well, I took a picture of him falling down the stairs as he went to Salzburg.
That would have been easy. I remember. Do you remember all those Saturday Night Live routines?
That was kind of hard to miss, actually. But
you didn't publish the picture. Is that journalistic integrity? Or
no, everybody else had it better. I'm at the foot of the ramp with my camera up like this and my arm out like that. So I was torn, but I didn't want to miss the shot. And, Yeah, I mean, pictures of him in his bathrobe
Yeah.
and mismatching clothes. I mean, he used to drive Mrs. Ford nuts with his wardrobe. And in fact, just recently, somebody said, what's it like working with all these people that used to be in the Ford administration? I said, it's like Rip Van Winkle. I woke up and all my friends are still in power, and but they're dressed better. They all used to wear plaid.
I wanted just a final question to you about campaigns, because you've covered your share of them. And I would imagine the challenge for that would be scene one, seen them all. That is essentially, it's a photo. The photo keeps being the same. Tell me I'm wrong. It's the candidate and it's the adoring fans, or maybe the fringe group of protesters, the ones carrying signs. So how do you claim it and make something interesting out of what is essentially a stock shot?
Well, it all changed when Robert Kennedy was shot. I mean, then part of the problem now is just security in general. I covered, I covered John McCain's campaign,
yes.
And that was as close to a Kennedy-like campaign with a different character at the center of it, of course. But he didn't have the security. There were just this kind of ragtag group of people, and it was Don Quixote attacking the windmill. And that was really good. And it was like inside, outside. I mean, sometimes, Diana knows, some of the best pictures really do happen outside in a public event. And I have a picture of Richard Nixon in the Grand Ole Opry opening, and he's using a yo-yo. And I'm sorry I don't have it here. It's a great shot. He's, Richard Nixon, a yo-yo. It's like, wow. But in the background is Ollie Atkins, who was his photographer. And I thought, man, I bet he wished he were in front. And we had no choice but to be out in front. And Diana's made great pictures on both sides.
Yes.
Both sides. But I mean, it depends on who's out there. They're not all the same. Pictures are not.
I wish you would describe that McCain photo in Sedona. That's an incredible image of yours. That was the day in which he withdrew.
He withdrew in March.
Describe that image to people.
I describe it as if Ansel Adams did politics. This is the picture they would take.
Yes.
It's sort of McCain and the press corps in the foreground. The background, there are mountains and clouds. It looks like clearing winter storm, with people in it.
Yeah.
And it's actually one of my favorite campaign pictures.
It's amazing. It's snow-capped mountains, and you just...
It's actually in my new book, Photo du Jour, on sale out here, but if anybody's really interested...
Okay, I get a commission for that, because I said you have
Nice
Diana.
question. I like that.
Thank you so much, David.
I've been photographing for Time magazine since I've been on contract to them since 1979. And I was, soon after joining Time, I started taking pictures over at the White House. And then I started doing it a lot there on an every other month basis. So I tell you, I see Cecil's pictures from the inside, and I see that not only the wonderful pictures with the children, and they're so human, but that picture on the airplane with Lyndon Johnson being sworn in, and I look at that picture and I think of the pressure on Cecil at that moment and what he must have been going through at that moment, and I think to myself, now that's a real pro. And I think that picture, I've always had the greatest admiration for that picture, but to meet him and to have him here is an honor to share the stage. And David, I went back to see President and Mrs. Ford for this book that I have on sale out in the office. Yes. It's called Public and Private. And I went to see the Fords, and I said, I was just starting to take pictures when David, when you were in the White House, and I had to sort of try and stop the president from going on about his friend and wonderful photographer David Kennerly. I mean, I was there to interview the president about my book and my pictures, and I could not get either one of them to stop talking about their wonderful friend and my former colleague and my competitor, my whatever, David, who's the best in the business. But anyway, I want to show you pictures starting with President Ford. just because I went in and out of the White House during the Ford and Carter years on a freelance basis for various newspapers and magazines, and then I joined Time in 1979 and covered the White House, as I said, on an every other month basis until the end of the Clinton administration, when I decided I would leave to see if I could take a picture outside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, which means outside the press pens and the all of the confines that we photographers who cover a president work within. So I'm going to start right away. Now, to go back to the book, it's called Public and Private. And this is the public part. And when I talk about public, I mean those pictures that are taken in as a White House photographer for Time magazine within a pack of other photographers. That's the public part of my book. The private part is what we hope for, and this is public, and this begins the private pictures. And what happened to me at with Time was that we got more and more interested in asking, as many news organizations do, for Time to get exclusive pictures, pictures that we are the only photojournalist in the room. The White House staff photographer is always there, but I would go in, we would ask permission for me to go in from time to time, exclusively for Time, and take pictures. And we felt at Time that these kinds of pictures perhaps would show you a little bit more about what makes a president tick, what a president is like, how he relates to his family. You know, and we all know, that everything the President of the United States does is totally choreographed. And it is a question of trying to see him away from the lights and mics and trying to get a better feeling through pictures of what the President's character and what the President's relationships are all about. We shot those pictures when I was given access. I shot these pictures in black and white to signal to you who looked at Time perhaps that these were exclusive pictures and that they were in some way special. These were taken on the Chobe River in Africa. What year? These were taken in 4 months after the Monica Lewinsky affair had broken. When we're out taking pictures of the president, we obviously take pictures of other things that we see, such as the helicopter or other events that, other people, other events. But I'm going to concentrate mostly on the public pictures and the private pictures. This was the morning Gerald Ford had lost the election the night before, and Mrs. Ford made the concessions announcement in the press room since the president had lost his voice during the last couple of days of the campaign. And this, no, I didn't know I'd ever seen the governor of Arkansas before 1991 or 92. And here he is with Rosa Parks and Rosalind Carter in 1979. This is on the Iowa at the anniversary of the Statue of Liberty, and to me it looks like the Reagans were wonderful at putting on very glorious photo opportunities, and this one seemed to me to look like a Busby Berkeley musical. Complete change of mood. Again, a public picture. This was at the funeral for the memorial service for the Marines lost in the explosion in Lebanon. The Queen, the Queen had visited California, and it had rained. It never stopped raining. And at the state dinner, which the President, Mrs. Reagan, gave for the Queen, she said, that she knew that the Puritans, when they came to the New World, had brought with them many of the customs from her country, but she had no idea they brought the rotten weather, too. Mr. T. And this picture was the first behind-the-scenes picture. I'm now moving into behind-the-scenes with the Reagans, and this was the first meeting of Mrs. Gorbachev and Mrs. Reagan, and it took place in Geneva. And David was my colleague at that time working for Time, and he was on the inside taking pictures of Reagan and Gorbachev, and I was on the inside with Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Gorbachev. Behind the scenes again at the White House. And this, I want you to know that this was the last interview that Walter Cronkite had of a sitting president while he was anchor of the CBS Evening News. And the president had a little sort of a champagne party for him after the interview was over in the Oval Office. And I was asked to come in quickly. I was shooting this for CBS. And I have asked every single man in that picture what the joke was, and none of them will tell me. This picture is not Mount Rushmore, David, because President Carter wasn't there. But this was the opening of the Nixon Library. And I have always thought it the most curious picture because Nixon had statues made of all the foreign leaders he'd met with during his administration. And to me, all the presidents seem so in character, much like the statues. The Air Force Academy. And this is a public picture, but it's just one of those things that happens that tells you we're always, when we're either out in public or in private, we're always trying to tell you something about the character of the president. That's sort of a mission. And here the president's grandchild climbed up on his lap at an entertainment before the inaugural, and she had a little pen light in her hand, and she must have asked the president to say, "Ah, Granddaddy." This was on the eve, really, of Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait. Actually, this was in Saudi Arabia with the troops about to go against Iraq. And now into the private pictures of the Bush administration. This is in Air Force One, and Marvin was trying to get the kids pulled together to get off the airplane, and Mrs. Bush is already out the door, and President Bush is going over his notes for his speech. And when I went to talk to the Bushes about these pictures for my book, they make sort of captions to all of the pictures, or to a lot of the pictures in the book, the president's words. Mrs. Bush said, the president said, "Oh, I love this office on Air Force One. It's so wonderful." And he goes on about doing this and that, and all of a sudden Mrs. Bush interrupted him, and she said, "Well, George, you can certainly tell I'm the only one who was ready." With his daughter, Doro. And this picture, I was doing behind the scenes with President Bush, and I came upon Mrs. Bush that day. And when I showed her this picture to comment on, she looked at it and she said, "Surely, Diana, if I'd known you were there taking pictures, I would have changed my shoes." This is the morning they came back from Houston after losing the election in 1992. These are the public pictures of President Clinton. This was with Yeltsin. This is here at the dedication of the John F. Kennedy Library Museum. In the desert of Jordan. In Red Square. This picture, this picture, we were in Red Square, obviously, and the president's mother had died just 2 days before we went on this trip to Moscow. And I don't know if you, I'm not familiar with the name of the church, but just on the edge of Red Square, as we were coming in to Red Square in the motorcade, the president stopped and got out and went up into a church, which has been converted back into a church with glasnost. It had been used as a gymnasium during the Soviet years, during communism in the Soviet Union. And the president came out afterwards, and we were in the motorcade waiting for him. And I think it was Sam Donaldson called to him and said something about, are you enjoying your trip to Moscow, Mr. President? It was the first time Clinton had been back to the Soviet Union since he had been a student. And he said that he was so moved by the fact that there was this newfound freedom in Russia. And he said, imagine being able to go into a church. And he said, I went into the church and I lit a candle for my mother. And his whole face came, his eyes filled up with tears, and that was the expression on his face as he said that. We were always taking headshots of the president. It's part of our job. And here he is in a very, on the eve of his re-election. And here he is in the last days before the impeachment vote. But I move now into what I think are the most important pictures to me that I took as a White House photographer for Time. And those are the ones behind the scenes particularly with President Clinton, because we had quite good access during those years. And I think they're important because, and I wish that it was occurring more with this White House. You can't get these kinds of pictures when there's a whole pack of photojournalists in the room. It just doesn't happen. And having this kind of access, I do believe these kinds of pictures illuminate the presidency. And if you're on staff, you have access. But when you're a journalist, you do not. You have to take what you are given. Now, people have argued with me and have said to me, but you're being used by the White House when you are allowed in. And my answer is yes. There's a pretty good chance that if we've asked for the access, that Time magazine is going to use the pictures, so that the White House staff knows pretty well that the following week these pictures will be in the magazine. That's not going to stop me for 1 second. Because if I'm allowed in that room, I'm there for you, basically. And I'm going to take advantage of that in every way I can to show you something that might lead to a better understanding of our presidency. And that is basically why I think these pictures that we all are asking for are important. I mean, the access, it's important to get it. And these pictures do have, I hope you will think, some information. This is the president working with his aides, writing a State of the Union. Mrs. Clinton in a relaxed moment with her chief of staff in the limousine. This isn't just because I think it's funny. This is the president preparing for his first debate with Dole. On Air Force One with his he told me for the book, he said, oh, look at that picture. My two favorite things in the world, playing hearts and the New York Times crossword puzzle. And this picture, The president was going out to make his acceptance speech of the nomination in 1996, and I was lurking there behind the scenes underneath the stage. And this goes to show you that even somebody as polished and as used to making speeches as President Clinton was and is, he too, just being announced on stage, had to stop to take a deep breath. This was taken the night this is the election night in 1996, and this is President Clinton receiving the phone call from Senator Dole conceding the election. This was in his suite at the hotel in Little Rock. And this picture kind of didn't need a caption, but when I showed it to Mrs. Clinton, this was Inauguration Day in 1997, and Mrs. Clinton said to me in the book, she said, you know, I wanted to see the outfit that Chelsea was going to wear at the inaugural, and I thought to myself as I looked at it, well, it's all right, provided she keeps her coat on, which, of course, she didn't. And this picture is when a journalist is lucky enough to get the kind of expression that Cecil was getting between the President Kennedy and Caroline. This is the president with his daughter behind the stage at one of the inaugural balls. And this picture, the president and the vice president saying grace before lunch. And this picture I have in it just to show you working conditions and the cast of characters. And this picture is to show you that they have a sense of humor. When I showed this to President Clinton, he said, oh, yes, I remember that. He said, we were in a holding room at a meeting, and we were all bored to death. And I kind of looked around, and I thought, you know, we kind of look like those monkeys. Hear no evil, see no evil. So they did it. And he said, look at that. Cohen is hear no evil. I'm speak no evil. Madeline is see no evil. And Sandy Berger, he's just plain evil. This is one of those times when you find yourself, we'd asked to be behind the scenes, and suddenly a peace initiative was announced. And I thought that I was not going to be behind the scenes, but the White House lived up to their promise that I could be. And this is King Hussein and Netanyahu and Arafat, who are speaking over in the corner. And everybody on the outside, outside the White House and across the world, I think, were waiting to find out if Arafat and Netanyahu were actually speaking to each other, and I found myself looking at them on a love seat. These behind-the-scenes pictures also go on the road, and I will go through these with you very quickly. Israel, Gaza, Ghana, South Africa, Botswana, Ghana. And to end up, the president, I had always wanted to be with the president, sitting president, his last days at the White House, and I was granted that access with the Clintons. And the president went to say goodbye to lots of people in those last couple of days, and he went to the White House mess, and he just couldn't resist the French fries. And quickly taking a look at the Gore campaign, a very public picture, but a pretty good vantage point. A behind-the-scenes picture from the campaign. And a final picture of Al Gore, the morning that President-elect Bush, came to the White House to go up to the inauguration up at the Capitol. The president and the vice president went upstairs, and they came down in the elevator. And that is Vice President Gore's face through the window of the private elevator minutes before he met President-elect Bush. This is the last walk-around for the Clintons. They were waiting for the Bushes to arrive on January 20th, 2001, and I was with Sharon Farmer, the White House staff photographer, and she and I were following the Clintons into the East Room, and suddenly Sharon stopped and she said, "Don't you think we've gone far enough?" And I said, "Yeah, I think you're right." The President-elect Bush arrived for the coffee. And this picture, I'd always wanted to be in this place, in the Oval Office with the President and his last moments there. And it was my last moment covering a sitting president, too, because I had decided, as I said, that my time was up doing this, too. He wrote a letter to incoming President George Bush. He left it on the desk. He walked over to the window. There was time for one frame. He turned around. He put his arm around the shoulder of John Podesta, and the two of them walked out to the waiting press on the colonnade. And this picture is when he was leaving Andrews Air Force Base. And I have it in because I think it shows you how what it's like to leave the presidency after 8 years. And I end with this picture of the President and Chelsea an hour later in New York at Kennedy Airport at a rally. And that was the last I saw of the President. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Will you describe what you look like on the job? You have necklaces of cameras around you, all those lenses. How many do you carry at a time?
3.
3 at once?
Yes.
What kind are they?
Cannons. Three cannons. Because you want to have all your lenses and things
available at any minute.
Susan, and you don't want to spend too much time going like this,
right.
But they're all interchangeable. In case you run out of film with one, you can quickly put that lens on the other. And then you have a camera bag, you have strobes, you have, film.
Yeah. It's why he walks gingerly.
As do
All
I.
that stuff. But are you always looking through one or the other? I mean, you can't afford to just have them hanging there, right?
Yes, you're
always looking.
Yes, you are.
And then you can make that last-minute decision to,
That's right.
to
But
look
in
through
the
the other one.
behind-the-scenes pictures that I showed you, I use much lighter equipment, and I use a very quiet camera. I use a Leica and much wider lenses because I don't need the long telephoto lenses for that kind of work.
And just talk about what goes in your mind, the aesthetics of a picture. I was so struck by the one in the Oval Office of Clinton where he's working with a staff, but your choice was to stand behind his desk and shoot them over all those family framed pictures. What was you thinking?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that picture because it was hard to show. So with all those people, how do you do it? So I just thought if I go opposite him, well, the only way I could do that was to go on this side of the desk. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because it's his desk. So I lift up my camera, I begin to shoot, and what do you think is right in front of me? A picture I took of the President and Mrs. Clinton and Chelsea. It's right in the center of his desk, and I'd given it to him. And I had no idea it was in the center of his desk. So I shot this picture, and when I sent it to New York, I mentioned it to my editor. I said, the funniest thing, it's my picture on the President's desk. And anyway, when it appeared in the magazine the next week, I said, do I get double credit for 2 pictures in one?
And what about the Reagan pictures, and what difference did it make that he was an actor? How did that change his relationship to the camera, or did it, compared to the others whom you covered?
That's an interesting question. I think that he was very used to a camera. Mm-hmm. I found him very, very aware of his bearing, very elegant in the way he walked and he moved, and he didn't act as if he was particularly worried by a camera, mm-hmm. where I always thought President Herbert Walker Bush didn't like it very much. Mm-hmm. Reagan was completely at ease with it, but he was quite formal also and quite aware that yes. we were there. With President Clinton, although he was very aware in public that a camera was there, and to me seemed to have a sort of a set of expressions. Behind the scenes, he was fabulous because he just ignored me entirely, mm-hmm. which was just what I wanted.
Sure.
I didn't want him. Of course, they all know I'm there, but it was the closest I could get as a photojournalist. I couldn't get any closer for you, so to speak.
Right, right. Are you always thinking about us? You've said that a few times, that you're there for us.
You know, I think I came to think that. I thought, this is extraordinary to be allowed in, and so get all the information you can. Mm-hmm. Because it's special, and it's important. You know, it's important even if to see the President Clinton drinks Diet Coke when he writes a speech, or President Bush is so informal that when furniture needs to be moved for people who don't have room to stand, he moves it.
Wow.
You know, all these things that Reagan would write a State of the Union on a yellow pad in longhand. These are interesting things, how they relate to their staff, how they talk to them, how they touch them, this is information. I think it's interesting. Mm-hmm.
What would you like to know about?
Ira, do you have any comments?
Sir.
First of all, a wonderful program. I got the feeling you had a lot of downtime. What did you?
Everybody is a question to everyone.
What did you do?
With the downtime? Oh, how'd you know that? You know, the night before, David, I'm sure, has a lot to say about this.
A lot of downtime stories, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of downtime stories. You're absolutely right. The night before, when you cover the White House, the night before, you can call the White House and find out a recording, what the president has on his agenda for the next day, what's going to be an open photo, what's not, et cetera, and you go to the White House, and it is your job to cover everything that happens, so you sit there a lot of the time. And you read, you play on your computer, you talk about football games. I mean, what else? What can you think of?
I don't know. It's like, I think it depends on what you're doing. I'm always so anxious, you know, I sit around.
Oh, it's very hard to concentrate on anything.
Because what's going to happen? It's a good question, but there's so many different answers for so many different circumstances. When I was the White House photographer, there was so little downtime, because when you're in between shooting, you're trying to identify stuff from the day before or whatever. The hardest thing is being in the White House, like sitting in the press room, and you know you're only going to get maybe a shot or two. I mean, I hate being over there doing that. I've done it off and on over the years, but that's the hardest thing, where unless something comes up, you can't leave unless they say, the president is not going to commit any more news today. You know, they give you a lid, they call it. So
they call it a what?
Lid.
A lid.
A lid.
A lid for the day.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that's the night they invade Iraq. Sure. You know, we got a lid. Anxiety is our byword.
Anything
downtime for me was military. I didn't have any downtime. I was always on.
Mm-hmm.
and I had no competition, so I didn't have to worry about what I was going to do to compete with somebody else. Around the house, I just was available.
Yeah.
And I got paid whether I did anything or not.
That's not bad.
There wasn't much downtime.
Yeah. What about you raised I like to talk about that between the two of you, the idea of competition. I mean, you were in competition with one another at various points, but there has to be a tremendous amount of cooperation as well. But when you are all sort of ganging up together to get that shot, is there a lot of elbowing and a lot of pushing to get ahead, get in front?
It's a good question, but I think generally, I think photographers kind of, in these situations you get thrown into where they really are like a scrum.
Yeah.
You don't, in fact, I took my, this is good actually, my son at the time was 12 years old, Byron, who's now 18, I went out on a 2-day campaign trip with me with Pat Buchanan, who was running for office in order to increase his speaking fees on CNN later probably. But he had all these people, like all the press guys were gathered around him. He went down to the Mexican border, which is one of his great issues about all these illegal immigrants. And so there were all these, like 6 television cameras of still photographers. And my son had a little video camera and got into a scrum. And he came out like this, and he was like covering his head. He says, "Dad, I finally have respect for what you do."
I think at the White House there, well, you know, these are people, we work with each other every day.
Yeah.
And so you have respect for your colleagues.
Right.
And I know perfectly well that if I fell down running to get someplace and got there late, my competitors, my colleagues, would find a spot for me. When we travel abroad, it's another subject. And it is very, very, very competitive, and sometimes it ends up being whatever person has the tallest ladder, frankly.
Yeah, yeah. And if you run out of film, somebody's going to give you a roll of film.
Yes, and of course
We don't run out of
now,
film
now there's
anymore.
no film.
You don't run out of digits. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah. How do you like that digital technology?
good.
Do you?
Yeah.
Do you, Diana?
Don't do it yet. I'm taking my time.
You have to get into the
I
21st
know,
century.
I know. I'm a dinosaur. Do you know, somebody said to me the other day at the White House, they said, "Is it true that you and Matthew Brady were pool for Lincoln's inaugural?"
And Helen Thomas was the pool reporter.
Your question, sir.
We can go on the road, you know.
It seemed to me in a lot of the photos that you were using ambient light, especially on the interior shots, and I was just wondering, does flash cause a problem for you with sort of interfering with the subjects, and whether maybe the use of high-speed films that are available now makes it easier to use ambient light on those inside shots?
You know, we don't use a flash in the Oval Office doing the kind of stuff that we get to do occasionally. The whole time I was in the Ford administration, I mean, my basic rule about using a flash is I use it when there's no light. And I know that sounds peculiar, but it's true. I mean, I don't, in the Oval Office all around, we try to, you can see how grainy her pictures were. Well, that's like really, you know, high-speed film blown up. And but we have to disturb. You can't shoot a flash off in the middle of an important meeting. I mean, that's pretty much.
In the regular coverage, the everyday coverage, the color work that you saw of mine, I have to have a strobe. And I use a strobe. And headshots and stuff like that taken in a thing where the president is lit, that's tungsten, so that's available.
In what sense lit? You mean?
Lit by television
like
cameras.
this, by this.
But,
It's a little joke.
you know,
Well, now that these youngsters...
but with black and white, with what you're talking about, when I went behind the scenes, I would never use a strobe because I didn't want to attract attention. And I didn't want to interrupt and make the flash, the noise, the everything. So I went to the fastest film possible, which is black and white, and at 3200. We felt at time it looked better than color neg. And also for all the other reasons, archivally it lasts longer. All the reasons we went for black and white with the behind the scenes. But you're absolutely right. They're all available. And I would never use a flash. I never carried a flash doing behind-the-scenes work with the president. And I figured if I couldn't make it hand-holding it with, you know, at a couple of seconds, that was too bad.
I have to go to the other side of the spectrum. Back in my days, these youngsters are talking digital and high-speed film. In the 60s, all we had was 100 ASA color film, and I tried to do everything in color that I could, and it was necessary to have flash, so I lived by the flash on a Hasselblad, which made a medium-sized negative, and it was ideal for enlarging at that point. But there were a lot of times when available light was available, and I used it with 35 and even the Hasselblad material. But for the documentary aspect of my job, which was to get the first picture to prove that Miss Cotton was there that day, and then maybe get another one in case one of their eyes were closed, those two pictures were made with flash, and you'll find them in the library here. So without the high-speed film, which came along a little later on, I was restricted to using flash, and it was, like I say, my right arm.
But your photo of the Johnson swearing in was with a flash, and you know, I can't imagine what that would have been like not to be prepared to take a picture like that. It was so. Yeah. It's the moment of.
I was very fortunate that day. I never did go into the technical details except in a Time magazine article way back in '67, when my good friend Hugh Sidey wrote a story about me and how I sweated to make that picture and all of the stress that I was going through that you alluded to. Thank you. And there was. The first time I pushed the button, the flash didn't work. So you know where you're feeling, how far you shrunk, about that big. But it was just a matter of a little connection on the solenoid, and I pushed it with my finger and pushed this second button, and the next 11 pictures were fine. But the first one was a dud, and I about dud myself. But I did make a series of available light because the cabin is filled with fluorescent tubes underneath, and I'm standing on a couch, and the lights are right there. So I had a lot of available light, and I shot maybe 15 or 20 available light, 35 black and whites. But I didn't shoot color, you'll notice, because we weren't transmitting color on wire photos in those days. In those days, it was, gentlemen, start your drums. You know, they had these cylinders that you put a wet 8x10 print on. And
I'm old enough to have done that.
I know.
Cecil, so.
And I gave up the speed graphic, too. Anyhow, it was the drum thing, and I'll kick myself forever for not peeling off that first print down in the Dallas newspaper darkroom after we transmitted it to New York, because I wrote the caption myself to make sure that my name got on the picture. And then the next day there was full page in the New York Times, AP photo. So I became an anonymous person.
AP. You'll have lots of chances to speak with the photographers at their book signing, but let's take one last question.
I do photography as a hobby, and I found myself sitting in the seat just wondering, like, what a great opportunity all of you had. Like, how could I do that? I'd love to do that. And maybe the question is like, what aspect of your personality or talents actually led to your getting that opportunity?
Good.
I guess I missed.
What part of your personality, what about you tapped in to so that you would choose this for
or so
a
that you
life's
were
work?
able to? How did you
well,
like
of course,
achieve
with
that?
me, as I mentioned earlier, it was a military assignment.
It was ordered.
I'd been doing it since 1940 for the government in one way or another, and all I did was shined up my buttons and made sure I was a decent, self-respecting sergeant in the Air Corps and a captain in the Army, and do my job well. And I rose to the top of the pyramid in my profession as far as how far you can go in the military. I left the office of the Secretary of Defense and the Pentagon and went to the White House, and the only other place to go is the Kremlin, I guess. I've never been there.
Really nice being in the Army.
David, how would you answer?
Insatiable curiosity. I want to know what's going on around that corner or that corner. I think that ever since I was a kid, the excitement, but mainly being curious about people, who they are, what makes them tick. It's sort of like getting under the hood of life, and looking at the engine. That's what I like.
Ms. Walker?
The same. I mean, I think the photographers see. And, you know, we're lucky enough to master a camera, you know, learn how to take a picture. And we have, we try and be perceptive and try and tell people something about what you saw, but in a way that gets a little bit underneath just what you saw. Mm-hmm. It's like get under a little so people can really understand a little bit more about life, I guess.
But why do you think you were chosen and not someone else?
Luck.
Maybe talent.
Perseverance.
Right place, right time.
This was a wonderful afternoon. I can't thank you enough for it. Thank you.